All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first ever Givology podcast. Today, we're joined by two folks from Wagenmager and Oberly law firm, which is a law firm based in Chicago that works mostly with the nonprofit sector. Paul Winters is a partner at Wagenmager and Oberly and has also been a lecturer and professor at both Northwestern Law and DePaul Law. Isabelle Flitsch is a paralegal currently at Wagenmaker and Oberly and earned her Bachelor of Arts from Wheaton College. And thank you both for joining us today. How's it going?
Going good. Thanks for having us. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here to talk with you today.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Great. And Paul, I'll start with you. What was it, first as a lawyer, when did you first start to get interested in working specifically in the nonprofit sector? Because there's so many different ways that you can go in law school, but what kind of drew you towards this and when did it happen?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Thank you. I actually began my career. I've had three careers. I've worked in information systems right out of college for large multinational corporation, and then felt called into Christian ministry. So I was went to seminary and was pastor of a Presbyterian church for 16 years, and then felt called out of that into the practice of law. I wanted to be part of a profession that let me get sort of out of the church and have an impact in the world. And, my personality is wired in such a way that law is a good fit, the way sort of I think, the way that I look at things. And because of my background as a church pastor, I was already pretty well acquainted with the nonprofit sector. Churches, of course, are nonprofits and tax exempt under 501c3 and 170B1A1 of the Internal Revenue Code. I didn't know that at that time. I just knew that I like to help people. And my now law partner, Sally Wagenmaker and Ryan Oberly, were at another firm and which I interviewed. And so they were gracious enough to hire me. And we began sort of this journey together back in 2013. We left that firm. We started our own firm, Wagenmaker and Oberly, which focuses exclusively on the nonprofit sector. And it's just been a real joy. I'm one of the lawyers that gets to go home at night and feel really good about the kind of stuff we did during the day and helping people. And yeah, so that's sort of how I got to where I am right now.
Great, thank you. And Isabelle, what drew you to Wagenmaker and Oberly, and what was your path to becoming a paralegal there?
Yeah, definitely. I had some experience working at law firms through high school and college, and I interned with the legal team at World Relief in college. And so that was kind of my introduction to the legal world. But after I graduated, didn't really want to take the plunge for law school quite yet. And so I was looking for something in a more corporate environment, but still wanted to be affiliated with nonprofits. And so I found Wagenmaker and Oberly, which was the perfect fit. And so everything just kind of came together, and I've been here now for 2 years and still really enjoying it. So kind of kicking the ball down the road for law school because I've been having a great time here.
That's fair. And I'm sure you'll have some great experience once you do end up going. What's something that each of you are most proud of, specifically from your work at the law firm?
Right. There are a lot to choose from. I mean, I'm going to put a couple out there. One is that each day we have the opportunity to assist nonprofits in making the world a better place. I love that. There are so many different diverse visions that people have for change. I think one of the cool things about Givology, by the way, is that it's an organization that recognizes the diversity of the nonprofit sector and seeks to have an impact across a broad base. So we're just fully endorsing of Givology. We're really grateful to be a part of that. And I think that that's really part of the thing that drives me. The second thing, if I have to pick up some things I feel good about, is the involvement at Northwestern and at DePaul. At DePaul, it's the law school where I have opportunity to intersect with really, really brilliant law students who are the next generation of attorneys. And it's amazing just to see the potential in each of these individuals. Right now, I'm teaching a class on nonprofit organizations at DePaul. and I'm about to teach a class at Northwestern on the same subject. And at DePaul, it's just really amazing to see just the input and the really thoughtful contributions. At Northwestern, it's a little bit different. I don't actually work in the law school. I work at the School for Continuing Studies, which is a school that really serves people in the nonprofit sector. So all the people in my class there are people that are already professionals, executive directors, presidents, treasurers, people who are plugged into a wide range of nonprofit organizations in Illinois and elsewhere, and who are wanting to understand better how the legal side of things impacts their operations and how they can become more streamlined, how they can be in better compliance. What are some of the pitfalls that are out there for nonprofits you need to be aware of? And so I have this nice balance. So I'd say the teaching part of what I do is just a real joy for me. I feel grateful to be able to be a part of that and to rub elbows with so many really, really smart, creative thinkers and really people that want to change the world.
That's great. Thank you. Isabelle?
Yeah, one of the things that there was a project that got started at the firm after I started that I got to be kind of on the front end of, which was it's focused on kind of international grant making. And we essentially, our firm's role is to vet charities in other countries and make sure that the IRS would be okay with money going to them from places in the US. And so working with that project and getting that off the ground was really cool. And I feel like it was a huge learning curve for me. And the whole time I was on the project, I was just continuously learning more and more, especially from an international perspective of, what charity means in other countries and like the similarities and differences between, how things work in the US versus other places around the world. And so that was a really cool experience, and getting to work on that project I found really fulfilling. So that was cool.
Yeah, that's something that I feel like I still need to learn more about is the humanitarian aid and what nonprofit means elsewhere. Our structure in the tax code is so complex already, but even just getting to be familiar with what it also means overseas is just, that's a whole other world. Speaking of that, there are, you guys are experts in the tax code and kind of how to classify a nonprofit organization. There's a lot of misconceptions about kind of what tax exempt organizations are and what a nonprofit is. And there's a lot that's in the Internal Revenue Code. Could you just give us a brief explanation of what it really means to be a tax exempt organization?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. You're right. There are a lot of misconceptions about what it means to be tax exempt and what 501c3 is. So just a brief explanation. Section 501 of the Internal Revenue Code, which is the common phrase that applies to Title 26 of the U.S. Code, deals with exemption from taxation, corporate taxation, on certain types of organizations. So 501A actually provides that organizations which are described under 501C are exempt from taxation on net revenue. So if you take an organization, if it was Coca-Cola made $1 million in a year, but they had expenses of $800,000, their net revenue is $200,000. And so there will be tax at the corporate rate on that, something like 21%. So 501A says anybody described in 501C is going to be exempt. And then 501C has a bunch of definitions. And there are 29. There are 29 different types of organizations under 501C. So 501C7, 501C9, whatever. The one that you most often hear about is 501C3, and that's by far the biggest subcategory. Those are organizations that are either public charities or private foundations. So for private foundation, think like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's a closely held organization. Public charity would be like American Red Cross or Giveology, organizations that have a broad base of public support and that type of programming. But there are other kinds of 501c organizations. So social welfare organizations are C4, described under C4. Labor unions are under C5. Trade associations, C6. Social clubs, C7, and on and on and on and on. Each one of them, excuse me, is described in different ways and has different rules and regulations for when tax exemption applies. And then there are other sections that apply to 501c3 organizations like 170, which deals with something that your listeners are going to be very interested in, and that's the deductibility of their contributions to Giveology. So because you're a 501c3 and a public charity, and you're described under C3 in another section called 509A1 and 170B1A6, because you're in all three of those, when they make a $10,000 contribution to Giveology under US tax law, it is likely that will be deductible from their personal income tax on Schedule A of Form 1040. So that's a lot of sections and details, but the bottom line is it's a special privilege section of the code that deals with benefits to charitable organizations and benefits to donors.
Yeah, I think that's what I've discovered is that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions is that tax exempt doesn't necessarily mean deductible, from your donations. That's a separate class. And, that can often be confusing.
Yeah, it is. And a lot of times people say, well, can I make a tax deductible contribution to a social welfare organization that does a lot of lobbying, for example? And the answer is probably no. Yeah. You cannot. You can't deduct that.
Yeah. So, and there's a piece up on Giveology in the resources section that covers a lot of the different types of organizations and classifications that you guys that others can go cover. You all know, but others can go and can look a little bit more closely at that stuff. One of the other things, just really quickly, Paul, that piece covers as well, but I think there's a lot of unknowns about because it's relatively new is a B Corp, public benefit corporation. Could you just give a basic definition of what a B Corp is?
Sure. A B corporation is a certain type of corporation. It's organized as a corporation under whatever the specific state law is here in Illinois, for example. But a B corporation is different in that it is permitted, unlike a regular corporation, to have social enterprise-like purposes as part of its corporate purpose. So in a normal for-profit context, the goal of the board of directors of a regular corporation is to maximize shareholder value. That's why people get stock, is so that stock appreciates in value. And the board is always interested in getting dividends to the shareholders and maximizing shareholder value. A B Corp is different in that it's allowed to make profits, but it also has a social purpose, some sort of certified social purpose. And there's an organization that's a nonprofit itself called B Labs, which certifies these B Corps. And they're allowed to take on these types of additional social purposes without the board of directors being worried about being subject to something called an ultra vires lawsuit, which is where the board is not doing what the board should do to maximize shareholder value. So the shareholder value and the social sensitive purpose sort of track hand in hand in a B Corp, unlike a traditional corporation, which may have social sensitivities and social aspirations, but it's not hardwired in their corporate purpose.
Great, thank you. And getting kind of down from the a little bit more 1,000-foot level, Isabelle, what there's different purposes, right, to all these different classifications, but in general, in your opinion, what is the benefit to tax exempt organizations overall? Why is it good for our government to say, certain organizations are exempt from taxes? What benefit does that have to society?
Sure. Yeah. And that's a great question. I feel like the main benefit is that it allows government to kind of hand over the reins in the realm of social welfare where government can't quite cover. And so it's kind of this gray area where nonprofits they're more agile. They're not subject to the slow moving government machine, but the government can still allow for and give them this special status so that they can achieve things with a little less burden, because there are various exemptions, as you know, that they are eligible for. And so it kind of frees up the nonprofit to be addressing those needs, and also in an area where the government then doesn't need to cover those needs. And so it's kind of they they operate in that in between. I don't know, Paul, if you have anything more to add to that answer.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Isabelle. There's this idea out there called the tax subsidy theory of nonprofits, which is basically describing exactly what Isabelle is saying, that, there are gaps in what the government can cover. And so that because, as Isabelle said, nonprofits are more agile, they're smaller, they're able to sort of rush to the need and meet it. The government rewards that by saying, okay, because you're meeting a need that we can't, we're going to reduce your obligations from a tax perspective. So we're going to make you tax exempt under a section of the code because you're meeting that need for us.
Yeah. I've always thought of it as like, any government social welfare programs, it's blanket coverage, right? It has to be, by its nature, kind of more equitable. And, that blanket though has holes and tears in it, as it does with anything. And so the nonprofit sector is kind of the patches that fills that. So.
Yeah, that's a really good way to think about it.
Paul, is there anywhere in the tax code that you feel like could be improved? Is there anything that we're missing out on that could change in the next 10 to 20 years?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of challenges, and I think that part of those challenges exist because our country is changing. There are new developments, new ways of thinking about things. I think that the Internal Revenue Code is going to have to change, for example, in the way that the courts in their application of the Internal Revenue Code are going to have to think pretty carefully about what it means for an organization to be religious, for example. I mean, these days, we have a lot of differing definitions of what it means to be religious or what it means to be a church. Church is a term of art. It doesn't mean Christian church. It can mean synagogue. It can mean mosque. It can mean an Eastern religion. It can mean a lot of things. And so as people's views of what religion is and churches change, the current definitions for church are very Judeo-Christian centric. There's a 14-point test that gets used as an associational test that gets used. And we're seeing that some of those definitions can't quite stand up to what we're seeing in terms of development. That would be one area. I think that other areas that are going to be challenging for courts and the legislatures to kind of work through are issues related to the lawful purpose of a nonprofit. So this is not in the statute 501c3, but it's codified in a number of really important cases like Bob Jones University, where you cannot, as a nonprofit, 501c3 cannot, as a nonprofit, subsidize or be in furtherance of issues that are against public policy. So Bob Jones was a case that dealt with anti-discrimination kinds of situations at a large, private but tax exempt nonprofit. And that nonprofit university lost its tax exemption temporarily because of a discriminatory dating policy that the university adopted. And so what constitutes the public policy of the United States is changing. And so having the IRS sort of figure out where those lines are, what is the public policy of the US with respect to things like sexual identity, for example, and some of those issues is going to be very interesting to watch. I think probably, to your point, it's coming up, in the next 5 to 10 years, those kinds of questions, I think, are going to be questions that the courts really need to deal with very substantially.
That's interesting. Is there one off the top of your head? You may not know this, but are there any cases currently like in litigation that could be precedent setting?
Well, there was a recent case going to the first issue, that the religion case. So it was a case in Wisconsin that was adjudicated in favor of a group called Freedom from Religion, where the district court in Wisconsin deemed the clergy housing allowance to be unconstitutional. Now, the Seventh Circuit, which is seated here in Chicago, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals overturned that case. So the clergy housing allowance is still intact, but that's a good case to show that things are very much in flux. Yeah. I'm not aware of a case right now that's pending, although there may be, that relates to the second issue that I talked to, the public policy and say sexual identity issues that are coming down the pike. But I think it's only a matter of time that this is going to be in front of courts and perhaps legislatures.
Yeah, that'll certainly be interesting to see what happens in the next few years. But Um, Getting more to like a nonprofit organizational level, Isabelle, you work really closely with the organizations that are your clients. You're kind of the one who's the point person for them a lot of times. What are some factors or variables that you've noticed when organizations meet with you that are kind of indicators of success? How do you know that an organization is doing a good job just from kind of meeting with them and talking with them?
That's a really good question. I think that just some things observationally are that if they're administratively organized, as a paralegal, I feel partial to that realm of nonprofits. But I think that if you're kind of on top of your policies and your bylaws and like focusing on just checking all the boxes to make sure you're organized up front, that leads to success later on of just smooth operations so that then you can focus on whatever your charitable purpose is, and less distractions later on down the road. So it's kind of being prepared ahead of time, and having all your ducks in a row, I've found to be a really, really good indicator. Paul, I don't know if you want to add to that as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I like to say nobody starts a nonprofit so they can develop bylaws. Right. I think I'll start a nonprofit so I can work on my articles of incorporation and policies. And people like you, Anthony, are people that want to change the world. And that's what we need. And so our job is to come along, world changers like you, and to help them build out the structure that Isabelle is talking about: strong bylaws, strong policy, strong articles of incorporation. I completely agree with Isabelle. When you find, people who are strong administratively, again, like you, Anthony, you're definitely one of the clients that's sort of out there in terms of really being capable and administratively sound. When you have clients that work like that, it bodes well for the future success of the organization, because when you put that good framework in place, it means that you're better protected against things like impermissible conflicts of interest, where you have somebody benefiting impermissibly. It means you know how to handle disputes when they happen, and people fight. People sometimes will see things differently, and we want to make sure those things don't escalate to a problem. So if you have a good framework in place, good bylaws, good ways of handling, a clear line of operations, things like that, like how do we make decisions appropriately, and do we make decisions that are in keeping with corporate law? I had a situation years ago where it was just a simple bylaws misunderstanding, but it was about something that we call notice. That is, how much notice do you have to give before a board of directors meeting? And it turned into a 3-year-long piece of litigation. We ended up winning, but it was just very costly to both sides. And, emotionally to us, even, it just broke our hearts to see this organization being torn apart. And it was all over this simple provision over how much notice do you have to give for a meeting to be valid. And because they didn't, our opponents didn't give proper notice, the judge voided 3 years of corporate actions. Wow. It was insane. And so all of that can be prevented if a corporation implements good structure, as Isabelle's saying, and then follows its own structure.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is no one starts a nonprofit to develop bylaws. It's such a common criticism of the nonprofit sector is that the people who start nonprofits and who are involved in nonprofits, and I'm using major air quotes right now because the nonprofit sector has come a long way, but are bleeding hearts who don't necessarily have the business acumen to run something efficiently. I think part of the goal of Giveology is to kind of highlight the work that the nonprofit sector is already doing, and that there are some amazing professionals and amazing organizations who are well run, who are organized and do things the right way. If one of the goals of this organization is to combat that stereotype there. So yeah, thank you. One more thing about the kind of the ways that you can see an organization is ready for success. A lot of those are internal. Is there anything that you can see as a donor from an outside perspective that would kind of give those red flags away?
Yeah, I think as a donor, you're looking for things like a strong independent board of directors, where you don't have a majority of the individuals on the board who are related to each other.
Mm-hmm.
You want to see that tax exemption letter from the IRS that says that the IRS has determined that they're tax exempted or 501c3. And then as a donor, you want to pay attention. If you're a large donor, you want to make sure you look at the subclassification on the top right-hand column of that letter, which tells you whether it's a private foundation or public charity, because that impacts how much money you can give. So you want to look at that. In terms of red flags, you would be looking for things like that you would be looking at the 990, the annual 990, which is the annual report. And if you would look on the 990 specifically for salaries that people get paid, so that's disclosed top paid personnel. You'd be looking at things like whether or not there are conflicts of interest, which you have to disclose in the 990. You will want to make sure, you want to see how much of the charity's money is going to administrative expenses versus charitable beneficiaries. The 990, in fact, is a really good resource that you can it's available to you at a website called guidestar.org, and it's free to join guidestar.org. It's a nonprofit. It's sort of a nonprofit police kind of website that lets you sort of check on websites that you're thinking about giving. But we do strongly encourage donors to look carefully at the way that organizations are operated. The things we've covered, strong articles, strong bylaws, strong policies, as Isabelle was saying. You can ask for copies of all that. I mean, they're private documents. The articles of a corporation are public. Bylaws and policies are typically private. But if you're an executive director of a large nonprofit and you have a large donor saying, "Can I see your bylaws before I make a $100,000 contribution?" that AD is going to say, "Yeah, here you go." And then that kind of transparency is a good marker of healthy operations.
Yeah, as you get more, as donors get more involved in the the operations and get more familiar with an organization that they're giving to and start giving more money, those are definitely benefits to ask all those questions. And for both of you, getting more to kind of the organization's day-to-day work, in your experience, what are some of the biggest challenges right now that nonprofit organizations are facing, either on a day-to-day basis or from like a strategic planning perspective?
Yeah, Isabelle, you want to take that one? Or
I would have to think about that one. Paul, do you want to start that one off?
Sure. So people come to us in one of two modes. They come in planning or crisis. When we see crises, it's usually because an organization has not either established good policies or implemented those good policies. So they'll come to us, and because we have situations periodically that are related to something we call founders syndrome. Founders, under nonprofit law, there are no owners of a nonprofit, but a lot of times founders feel like, I own my nonprofit, and they don't. And so when you have a long-term founder and you have a strong board, sometimes the board will push back against the founder, and the founder will think, what in the world's going on here? This is my nonprofit. And of course, the legal answer is no, it's not. The board ultimately has control. So one of the challenges we do see are situations where founders will come in and they'll ask us to do something. We'll need to do some education and training. A lot of challenges will come in where, because there are so many different governmental organizations that have oversight, just in Illinois, let's suppose you're a property owner in Illinois, a nonprofit that owns property. So you're subject to the Secretary of State. You're subject to the Illinois Attorney General with respect to so Secretary of State would be like your articles of incorporation, the existence of your business. The Attorney General would be if you raise any money in Illinois. The Department of Revenue would be if you own property, you might want a tax exemption on real property. The IRS, which is a federal agency. And then if you're doing certain types of activities, you might have groups like the FTC, or if you're doing electioneering, the FEC. You have a lot of other entities. And because there are so many different governmental entities that are watching your organization, it's easy to lose track. And so you have really well-meaning people. It's not like, the vast majority or even a significant minority of nonprofit leaders are nefarious. They're not. It's just there's so much to keep track of. And so I'm sure, is Isabelle's in a few of our practice groups. She's in a real estate practice group, a startup practice group, a corporate practice group. She sees a wide range of issues that come up that are people like, well, I didn't even know that was a thing. I didn't know that was something I had to be aware of. And so a part of it, it may sound self-serving, but if you don't call Wagenmager and Oberly, you should call some lawyer and an accountant also, an accountant with experience in the nonprofit sector who can help walk you through all the various compliance obligations. If you're going to take one thing away from some of the things that we say, it's get professional help where you don't know it. Because those professionals will have some awareness of where your obligations are.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And to kind of add to that answer, I think that what in my practice groups that I work in, it tends to be when there's been some sort of transition in the organization that then, to what Paul's saying, there are new regulations or new things that they need to be aware of. And then they're coming to us or to wherever their professional help is going to come in. And then that's when there starts to be a higher burden of, reporting or learning or whatever it might be. So I think that's generally the nonprofits that I'm seeing in my practice groups. They're either going through a transition or about to go through some sort of corporate transition or real estate purchase or something like that, where then there are different regulations or they're transitioning in some way. That tends to be what it is.
That's a great point. Like, just to what Isabelle is saying, let's take one of the most simple changes, and that is a change to the corporate name. Let's suppose we're going to amend our name. So now there are at least 4 things going on. You need to amend the name with the Secretary of State to put the public on notice that the name has changed. You have to notify the IRS that the records have changed. If you own property, you have to notify the Cook County or whatever county you're in that there's with an affidavit of name change or something like it, affidavit of ownership, to notify the general public that the person that owned this, the legal person that owned this property, now is named this. You might have to notify the Attorney General, and any contractual agreements that you have to notify vendors. It's the simplest thing. We're just going to change our name, but it has, and we'll get involved. Isabelle's in a number of these practice groups, and so we'll say, okay, we're going to change the name, and my corporate practice group will handle the name change, and then we need to hand it off to the real estate people because they know how to do the affidavit of name change. Then we have to talk to our Fed tax people and say, hey, here's a name change, and then it's just a tiny little thing, but all these far-reaching. So I really affirm what Isabelle is saying about times of transition. Definitely a key time where you want to have help.
Yeah, and I think kind of what I think people can learn from this is that while there's benefits to being a tax exempt organization, obviously, when you compare and contrast the for-profit sector, the nonprofit sector, it's at least 5 times more complicated to operate as a nonprofit organization. And I think that's part of something that I think donors and volunteers and other interested people should always keep in mind, is that the lives of these employees are so much more complex just because of their status.
Yeah, I use the analogy of horses and zebras. Horses and zebras sort of look like each other, right? Generally, but they're actually different species. And so for-profit corporations and nonprofit corporations sort of look like each other, basically, but they're different species and they have just different rules.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And lastly, I think one of the main goals of Giveology as an organization is to highlight great nonprofit organizations already doing work in local or larger communities. I just want from each of you to talk about a nonprofit organization that you have either been involved with or in contact with that you feel like people need to know more about.
Sure, and we're a little bit limited because we have confidentiality obligations to most of our clients. One, however, with organization has given me permission to talk about their work and our law firm's relationship with them is an organization that's called Wish Upon a Wedding, which is a wonderful organization that is all about helping couples who are facing life-changing circumstances. Usually what's happening in these situations, you have an engaged couple where one of the individuals perhaps has a terminal illness. And so Wish Upon a Wedding comes in with a bunch of skilled wedding professionals who are in the charitable sector, and they provide a full wedding for that couple. It's a really wonderful thing. And they bring in, I mean, it's not like, a little wedding like in the church basement kind of a thing. It's a big production, and they really build into this couple who's just going through, really in many ways, the best of times and worst of times. They're in love, and yet their lives are destined to be shortened together, it appears. And so Wish Upon a Wedding has a bunch of really skilled professionals that come in, and they'll do the band and the venue and the decorations and the flowers and the dress. And they're a California corporation with offices here in Chicago. And we've worked with them since, I want to say 2015 or so. It's just been a real joy and privilege to work alongside them. And but I also feel like, we need to trumpet our horn for Giveology. We're really excited about what you're doing. And honestly, it's a very innovative approach to things. And so we're thrilled about being a partner with you, a legal partner with you. And because I think that the impact of Giveology is going to be across a wide range of nonprofit sectors. And Anthony, you're doing such a good job of getting it organized and well run. And we have nothing but just the highest hopes for this organization. So any of you who are out there listening, strongly consider supporting Giveology as well.
Well, thank you, Paul. I appreciate all the compliments, and we truly could not have set up such a strong foundation without the both of you.
Thank you.
Isabelle, is there an organization that you'd like to shout out? It can be anybody. It doesn't have to be a client.
Okay. Yeah. I'll talk about World Relief. I really enjoyed working for them. They do some really cool legal assistance for immigrants and refugees. And they also have like refugee resettlement programs and counseling. Like they do a lot of, it's kind of a holistic resettlement of the person, instead of just being like, here, we'll get you, whatever visa or green card or whatever they're working on. They actually kind of address the entire transition. And so I had a really great experience getting to intern there, and it's a really relational nonprofit. And they're really impressive with what they do. So I really enjoyed working there, and I think that they're fantastic.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you both for shouting out some of your favorites. And unless there's anything else, I think that is the end. Thank you for joining us on the first ever Giveology podcast. And thank you for all your help.